The morning Fannie Hayes loaded her last crate onto the wagon. The sky above Caldwell County, Kansas, was the color of a bruise that had not yet finished forming purple and green and wrong in every way a sky could be wrong. And she took one look at it and decided she was not going to wait around to find out what it meant. It was the summer of 1878, and the land along Bitter Creek had been generous to a fault that year. The spring rains had come longer than anyone could remember, soaking deep into the red clay, filling the creek bed until the water ran high and brown and fast along its eastern bank. The homesteaders who had settled the lower draw 3 years before, when the land opened up and the government handed out parcels like promises at a revival meeting, had watched the water creep steadily up through May and into June. Most of them shrugged and went about their business. Most of them had not lost everything once before. Fannie Hayes had. She was 24 years old, brown-haired and brown-eyed, with hands that told more truth about her life than any document could, calloused across the palms, nicked at the knuckles, steady as a carpenter's level even when her voice was not quite. She had come out to Kansas from Missouri 3 years prior with her father, Samuel Hayes, who had believed in the land the way some men believe in Scripture, completely, without reservation, with a kind of holy stubbornness that outlasted his common sense. He had died in the winter of 1876, not from anything dramatic, not from outlaws or stampedes or the kind of death that made good stories, but from a chest cold that settled in and would not leave, the way certain kinds of grief do. He had left Fannie the parcel, the mule, the wagon, and a tin box of tools beneath the floorboards of the soddy. She had worked the land herself. She had hired out her labor to the Delacroix farm 3 miles north when she needed cash for seed, and she had come home in the evenings and worked her own rows by the last light of dusk. She had neighbors, Mrs. Etta Cobb, who ran a tight house with 6 children and 1 surviving husband, and old Pete Morrow, who had been on the frontier since before the war and who knew the land the way you know the face of someone you have loved too long and too hard to see clearly anymore. She had, in the strange and particular way of the frontier, a life. It was not always comfortable. It was not always safe. But it was hers, and she had made it, and she was proud of it with a quiet intensity she almost never spoke out loud. And now the creek was going to take it. She had understood this 4 days ago when she had walked down to the bank at first light and seen the water line. It was not just high. It was advancing. The cottonwoods along the southern edge had their roots under water up to the knee, and the low field, her best field, the one she had spent 2 full seasons amending with composted grass and manure, until the soil was dark and crumbling, and rich was already sheeted with standing water in the low corners. She had stood there in the gray morning light, barefoot in the damp grass, and she had done the arithmetic the way her father had taught her, which was to say plainly and without flinching. If the creek rose another foot, and the sky said it would, the lower field was gone. If it rose 2 feet, the root cellar flooded, which meant the potatoes and turnips and the jars of preserved peaches and tomatoes she had spent the whole of August putting up were gone. If it rose 3 feet and she was looking at a sky that was absolutely capable of 3 feet, the soddy itself would take water through the floor, and the walls would begin to wick it up and the structure would weaken, and there went everything. She had stood there until the arithmetic was finished, and then she had turned around and walked back to the house and begun packing. She had not panicked. She had not wept, though she wanted to fiercely, the way you want to weep when you have worked yourself to the edge of your endurance, and the land still tells you it is not enough. She had moved through the house with a methodical grace that would have looked, to anyone watching, like the movements of a woman who had done this before in her mind many times and was now simply executing the plan. She wrapped her mother's mirror in a horse blanket. She packed the tin box of tools. She packed her father's Bible and the small crochet work her mother had made before she died. Fannie had been 9, and the crochet was a tablecloth in cream and pale blue that she carried rolled in a flour sack wherever she went, because it was the most beautiful thing she had ever owned and also the most breakable. She packed seed. She always packed seed first, actually, before the mirror and before the Bible, because the seed was the future and everything else was the past. And on the frontier, you could not afford to love the past more than the future, or you would not survive. She loaded the wagon steadily through 3 days, working around the rain when it came, covering the load with the oilcloth she had stitched herself from 2 smaller pieces, triple seaming the join because she did not trust a single seam in weather like this. She borrowed 2 extra mules from Etta Cobb, who had looked at the sky in Fannie's loaded wagon and said, "Smart girl," in a tone that was both a compliment and a confession that she was not being as smart herself, not yet. On the morning of the 4th day, Fannie hitched all 3 mules, her own Bess and Etta's gray pair, Chester and me, and loaded the last of it. The cast iron skillet, the Dutch oven, the one good lamp, the small chest of clothes. She walked through the soddy once more, slowly, checking every corner, every shelf. She took the tin of coffee from the mantel shelf and the bag of cornmeal from the hook by the door. She stood in the center of the single room that had been her home for 3 years, and she breathed through her nose, steady and deliberate. And she said quietly to the walls and the packed dirt floor and the small window her father had framed with real lumber because he believed a woman needed light, she said, "Thank you." And then she walked out. She had left one space open on the wagon bench, just one, on her right side because she drove with her left hand when she was tired. The space was not accidental. She had considered it 3 full seconds before deciding to leave it, which was, for Fannie Hayes, a long time to deliberate. The reason for that space was Jeremiah Hale, and the reason she had deliberated was that she was not entirely sure what Jeremiah Hale was to her yet, and the space on the wagon bench was, whether she admitted it in those words or not, a question she was leaving open. Jeremiah Hale was 27 years old and had come to Caldwell County from Texas by way of a cattle drive that had deposited him in Wichita in 1875 with $32, a horse named Clover, and the particular freedom of a man who has no one anywhere waiting for him and has recently had time on a long trail to think about whether that is the life he actually wants. He had ridden south and west looking for land, and had filed a claim on 160 acres 2 miles north and east of Bitter Creek, on a slight rise that put him above the flood line of an ordinary year, and made him, in wet years like this one, the highest ground in the immediate vicinity. He was not, at first glance, a man you would necessarily trust. He was tall, well over 6 feet, and lean in the way of men who work hard and eat when they can and do not think much about the eating. And he had a face that was weathered in ways that made it difficult to age him precisely, with gray eyes that were so direct in their attention that people sometimes felt, upon meeting him, that they had been examined and evaluated before they had finished saying their name. He wore a gun the way all men wore guns in Kansas in 1878, which was to say on his hip, and not as a statement, but as a tool, the same way he wore his knife and his gloves and his spurs. He was quiet in company, but not the uncomfortable kind of quiet, more the kind that came from a man who had learned, through experience rather than instruction, that speaking required something to say. Fannie had met him in the fall of 1876, 3 months after her father died. She had been attempting to repair a section of fence line along her northern boundary, where the posts had rotted near the ground, and she had been doing it adequately but slowly, and Jeremiah had been riding past on his way back from the general store in the settlement, and had stopped, not with any presumption, not with the particular kind of help that is really just criticism in work clothes, but simply with a look that asked if she wanted an extra pair of hands. She had studied him for a moment and said yes, and they had worked the rest of the afternoon together mostly in silence, and when the fence was repaired he had said, "Good posts you used," because she had chosen them well, and she had said, "Thank you," and they had both understood that something had been established, though neither of them could have named it precisely at the time. After that, they helped each other the way neighbors on the frontier helped each other, which was practically and without sentiment, because sentiment was a luxury and practicality kept you alive. He helped her with the fall harvest when she was short-handed. She helped him put up a proper kitchen garden the following spring, because he had land sense for the big crops, but he was bewildered by kitchen gardening, and she was not. He brought her a haunch of venison after a successful hunt in November of 1877. She brought him a jar of apple butter she had made from the Delacroix orchard windfalls, because she had made more than she needed, and waste on the frontier was its own kind of sin. Through all of this, something was building between them the way flood water builds, slowly at first, invisibly, running along the channels that have always been there, and then with a gathering momentum that is surprising only if you have not been paying attention to the sky. Fannie had been paying attention. She was not a woman who missed things. She had noticed the way Jeremiah looked at her when he thought she was not looking, with an expression that was not the blank appraisal of a man assessing a capable neighbor, but something considerably more personal and considerably more complicated. She had noticed the way he found reasons to ride past her place when his route did not strictly require it. She had noticed, in the fall of 1877, that he had started keeping his hair cut shorter and his shirts cleaner, which on the frontier was as eloquent as a sonnet. She had also noticed her own hands, the way they moved differently when he was near, not nervously, because she was not a nervous woman, but with a kind of heightened awareness, as though the air between them had more weight than ordinary air. She had noticed that she talked to him more than she talked to anyone else, and not just about practical things, but about her father and about Missouri, and about the things she wanted that she did not often let herself want out loud. He listened the way very few people ever listened, with his full attention, and without the fidgeting impatience that most people brought to the act of hearing someone else speak. He listened like listening was an honor, but they had never spoken of it. This was partly the time and the place, which did not encourage that kind of speech, and partly Fannie, who had learned to hold the most important things close because the frontier had a way of taking what you loved if you declared it too loudly, and partly Jeremiah, who was working up to something he was not sure he had the right words for. So the space on the wagon bench was a question. It was Fannie's way of saying, "I am not asking, but I am leaving room." She climbed up onto the bench and settled the reins in her hands and looked at the sky one more time. It was worse than when she had woken up. The clouds in the northwest were the color of old iron, and they were moving fast, pushing ahead of them a wind that smelled like rain the way the inside of a well smells like water, deep and mineral and inevitable. She calculated she had maybe 2 hours before the real rain came. The creek, she guessed, would crest sometime in the night or early tomorrow morning. She clucked to the mules and they leaned into their harness, and the wagon began to move, and Fannie Hayes drove north along the track that ran beside the fence line, away from Bitter Creek and toward higher ground, and she had been moving for approximately 20 minutes when she heard the sound of a horse at full gallop coming up behind her, and she did not need to turn around to know who it was, because she knew the sound of Clover's hooves the way she knew the sound of her own heartbeat. Jeremiah Hale was riding like his coat was on fire, bent low over the horse's neck, his hat pushed back by the wind of his speed, and when he came up alongside the wagon and pulled Clover back to a matching pace, he was breathing hard, his gray eyes wide, and he said between breaths, with the urgency of a man who has rehearsed this sentence the whole way here and is currently watching it become unnecessary, he said, "Fannie, the creek. It's rising fast. You need to—" He stopped. He looked at the wagon. He looked at the 3 mules pulling it. He looked at the careful load under the oilcloth, the Dutch oven strapped to the side, the flour sack he recognized as the one she kept her mother's crochet in, hanging off the back hook. He looked at the empty space on the bench beside her, and he looked at Fannie Hayes, who was looking at him with an expression that was equal parts composed and warm and something that might, in a less reserved woman, have looked outright tender. "You already know," he said. "I already know," she agreed. He sat back in the saddle, and something happened to his face that was not quite a laugh and not quite relief, but contained both. He passed one hand over his jaw, a gesture she had learned meant he was recalibrating, adjusting to circumstances he had not fully predicted, and then he looked at the bench beside her again. "That space," he said carefully. "It is there," she said, "if you want it." The rain started then, the first real drops of it, fat and cold and serious, hitting the oilcloth with the sound of fingers tapping on a drum. Clover shook her head against it. The mules pressed forward. The sky above them lowered and darkened, and the wind picked up until it was pushing the tall grass flat against the ground in long, running waves. Jeremiah Hale looked at Fannie Hayes for a moment that felt longer than the weather could reasonably afford. Then he stepped down from Clover, not dismounting in a hurry, but deliberately, with the deliberate quality of a decision being made with full knowledge of its weight. And he tied Clover's lead to the back of the wagon, and he climbed up onto the bench and took the seat she had left for him, and the wagon rolled on through the rising rain toward higher ground. They did not speak immediately. This was not awkward. It was the kind of silence that two people share when something has just been settled between them that has been unsettled for a very long time, and both of them are sitting inside the settling of it, feeling its shape. The rain came harder. Fannie kept her hands on the reins and her eyes on the track, reading the going the way a river pilot reads the current, adjusting the team around a soft patch here, a rut there. Jeremiah sat beside her with his shoulder 6 inches from hers and watched the land and the sky with the same attention he brought to everything, and after a while he said, "You packed the seed." "First thing," she said. "I would have too," he said. "First thing." She glanced at him sideways. He was watching the track ahead, but the corner of his mouth had the particular elevation that was as close as he usually came to a full smile, and it occurred to her, not for the first time but with more clarity than before, that she liked his face very much. She liked the way it did not perform anything. It simply was what it was, honest as a fence post, and she trusted it. "Where are you heading?" he asked. "Pete Morrow's barn, if he will have me." "It is the highest ground on this side of the county line. His place is on the limestone shelf." "He will have you," Jeremiah said. Pete Morrow would take in a traveling circus if it showed up in his yard in weather like this. This was true. Pete Morrow was 71 years old and had the generosity of a man who had been given back his life more than once by the kindness of strangers, and had made a private vow to redistribute that kindness for as long as he was standing. He had been a trapper and then a scout and then, in his later years, a homesteader, and he had the kind of deep, practical wisdom about the land that was not written in any book, because the people who held it had always been too busy using it to write it down. "What about your place?" Fannie asked. She kept her voice neutral, careful, because she did not want him to hear the thing behind the question, which was that she had been worrying about his place for 3 days now and had not had an occasion to say so. "I moved the stock yesterday. Cattle to the Delacroix upper pasture Alphonse Delacroix, and I came to an arrangement. The horses are at Martinez's livery in the settlement. I moved what I needed to move from the house this morning." He paused. "My place is on the rise. I do not think it floods." But I was not easy about it. "You moved your things this morning," she said slowly. "And then I looked at the creek," he said, "and then I looked at the sky, and then I rode to your place as fast as Clover would carry me." She let this sit for a moment. The rain was coming sideways now, and she adjusted her hat and leaned slightly forward, watching the track. "I had been down to the creek at dawn," she said. "I finished loading before the sun was fully up. I have been on the road near half an hour." "I know," he said. "I could see the ruts." She thought about that, about him reading her tracks in the mud, understanding from the depth and spacing of the wagon wheels that she was loaded and moving with intention, following her trail at a gallop. "You were afraid for me," she said. It was not a question. He turned to look at her directly then, and she turned to look at him, and the rain was hammering the oilcloth, and the mules were leaning into their work, and the world around them was loud and wet and urgent, and his gray eyes were very steady. "Yes," he said, "just that." One word, simple and complete and without any ornamentation, and it landed in her chest like something she had not known she was cold from the absence of until this moment when it arrived. She turned back to the track. After a moment she said, "I left you the seat." "I know," he said. "I was not certain you would come," she said, and this was as close as she was going to get today to saying what she meant, but he heard it, because he heard everything she said, including the things she did not say in words. "I was always going to come," he said. "I was trying to find a reason to come that was not." He stopped. He tried again. "I did not want to presume." "You are not presuming," she said. The track curved north and the rain hit them from the other side now, and the cottonwoods along the creek, visible at a distance through the gray curtain of rain, were bending dramatically, their silvery leaves turning up to show their pale undersides, which was always the sign that the real weather had arrived and intended to stay. Behind them, at a distance of perhaps a mile, Bitter Creek was invisible but audible, or perhaps that was the thunder. It was difficult to say, a low, rolling presence in the earth and the air that spoke of a great quantity of water moving with great determination toward the low places. They reached Pete Morrow's place an hour later, coming up the long limestone shelf track in rain so heavy the mules had their heads down and were moving by instinct and muscle rather than sight. Pete was on the porch, because Pete Morrow did not hide from weather, and when he saw the wagon he raised one hand in a gesture that meant both welcome and "I told you so," because he had been watching the sky for a week, and he had told several people in the settlement what was coming, and most of them had not listened. He was a small man, compact and weathered like old oak, with a white beard and eyes that were still sharp at 71. "Fannie Hayes," he said, coming off the porch with no apparent concern for the rain. "Smart girl, pull the team into the barn. I have got the south stalls cleared." "Thank you, Pete," she said, and then, "I have Jeremiah Hale with me." Pete looked at the bench, saw Jeremiah, and a slow smile came across his face that was considerably more knowing than the occasion strictly required. "I see that," he said. He looked between them with the pleased expression of a man who has watched two separate rivers for 2 years and is now watching them converge. "Welcome, son. Pull her on up." The barn was large by frontier standards, because Pete Morrow had built things to last back when he had the strength for it, and it was warm with the body heat of his own 3 horses and the milk cow and the 2 pigs he kept in the back pen. Fannie drove the team in, and Pete and Jeremiah worked together to unhitch the mules and get them settled in the south stalls, and Fannie climbed down and stood in the barn and listened to the rain on the roof, which was a sound completely different from the rain in the open, enclosed, rhythmic, almost safe. She began to check the load on the wagon, making sure nothing had shifted or taken water. The oilcloth had held along its triple seam she was relieved to find. She checked the flour sack with her mother's crochet work, found it dry. She found the seed chest dry. She stood for a moment with her hand on the chest and breathed. "It is all right," Jeremiah said behind her. He had appeared quietly the way he did without announcement, and his voice was low and close. She turned around. He was 3 feet away, rain still dripping from the brim of his hat, and he was looking at her with that expression she had been studying for 2 years, the one she could not quite name, but that made her feel, every time she saw it, that she was being seen entirely. "I know," she said. "I just need a moment." He nodded. He understood about needing a moment. He had never once tried to rush her out of one. She took her moment. Then she pulled her shoulders back and looked at him steadily. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for the seat," he said. From the other side of the barn Pete Morrow was humming something vaguely resembling a hymn and was very deliberately keeping his back to them, which was both generous and not particularly subtle. Fannie almost laughed. Almost. She pressed her lips together and looked at the middle distance for a second, and then she looked back at Jeremiah Hale and said, "Are you hungry?" "Considerably," he said. "Then let us see what Pete has in his kitchen." What Pete had in his kitchen turned out to be a remarkable amount of smoked ham, a pot of beans that had been going since yesterday, 2 loaves of corn bread he had baked that morning, because he had known, with the old knowledge, that he was going to have company, and a jar of sorghum that he produced with the quiet pride of a man who has been making sorghum for 40 years and knows it is good. They sat around Pete's table, the three of them, with the rain hammering the windows and the lamp lit against the early dark of the storm afternoon, and they ate and Pete talked, because Pete always talked over meals, which was how he had survived a lifetime alone. He had never been alone during a meal, not really, because he had always talked his way through them. He talked about the flood of 1869, which had taken the whole of the Cimarron River Valley bottom in one night, and deposited a layer of rich silt across 40 miles of land that had made every farm in the bottom exceptionally productive for the following 3 years, which was, he said, the land's way of paying you back for what it took. He talked about the creek, its patterns, its moods, the particular shape of the limestone shelf they were sitting on, and why it had never flooded in the 60 years he had any knowledge of. He talked about the birds he had seen flying south that morning, a kind of private almanac, because birds knew before anyone else. He talked about a family named Collier who had settled 3 miles east of Fannie's place in 1875, and who had not, as far as Pete knew, moved, and he said it with a furrow in his brow that expressed both concern and the limits of what one man could do. "I will ride out tomorrow if it clears," Jeremiah said. "Check on the Collier family." "And the Cobbs," Fannie said. "Etta lent me her mules. She knows what is coming, but she has 6 children, and sometimes that makes a woman dig in instead of move out." "I know it," Pete said. "Her husband's father is buried on that land. Some people will not leave their dead." This was a thought that sat heavily for a moment. The rain answered it by intensifying briefly, a burst of it that made the windows rattle, and then settling back to its steady work. After supper, Pete showed Fannie to the small room off the kitchen that had been his daughter's room before his daughter had married a man in Wichita and gone to live a different life. It was spare and clean, with a narrow bed and a braided rug and a window that looked out at the barn. Jeremiah would sleep in the barn itself, in the tack room, which was a common enough arrangement on the frontier that no one gave it a second thought. But before they separated for the night, standing in the kitchen with Pete already retired and the lamp burning low and the rain still going, Jeremiah said, "Fannie." She stopped, her hand on the doorframe. "What I said," he said. "On the wagon. I want you to know it was not just about the creek." She turned around slowly. He was standing with his hands at his sides, not a defensive posture, not a reaching one, just standing there, open and direct, the way he stood when he had decided to say a true thing and was going to say it regardless. "I know that," she said. "I have been trying to find the right way to say it for a while now," he said. "The right time. And I kept waiting and the time kept not arriving, and then the creek started rising and I thought," he stopped, and the thing that moved across his face was half frustration and half something rower. "I thought, what if I wait for the right time and by the time I get there something has happened to the wrong time, and now it is too late?" Fannie Hayes stood in the doorway with the lamplight behind her and her brown eyes steady on his face, and she said, with great care, "It is not too late." He let out a long breath. The rain went on and on. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you are willing." "I am willing," she said. He nodded, a slow nod, a receiving kind. "Good." "Good," she agreed. She went to her room. He went to the barn. The rain kept falling all night, and Bitter Creek crested before dawn, and the lower draw where Fannie's soddy stood was, by morning, 3 feet under muddy water that moved in slow, purposeful circles around the submerged fences and the soddy walls and the garden she had spent 2 years building. She could not see any of this from Pete Morrow's porch, where she stood in the early light with her coffee cup and watched the sky slowly become something lighter, the storm having said what it came to say and now moving east toward other people's lives. Jeremiah came from the barn and stood beside her on the porch. He looked at the sky. He looked at her. He poured himself coffee from the pot she had brought out, and he stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him on her left side, which was the side she drove with when she was tired, and she thought, "Yes, that is right, that is exactly right. Can you tell what it looks like?" she asked, meaning the flood, meaning her place. "The water will recede in 2 or 3 days if the rain stays gone," he said. "The soddy may hold. Those walls are thick." "The low field is finished for this season," she said. "Yes," he said, because he would not lie to her about practical things. "But the soil will be richer for it come spring." She thought about Pete's story of the 1869 flood, the silt, the 3 years of exceptional crops. She thought about the seed chest in the wagon, dry in the oilcloth. She thought about the space on the wagon bench and the man who had ridden at a gallop to fill it. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like to put in a root cellar above the flood line when I go back, higher up the slope." "I can help you dig it," he said. "I know you can," she said, and the simplicity of it, the certainty of it, was the most comfortable thing she had felt in years. The days at Pete Morrow's place were not idle ones. Pete's barn had more work than one old man could manage in ordinary times, and the flood had complicated things. 2 of his fence lines at the lower edge of the property had taken damage. A section of the barn roof had developed a leak that sent a thin stream of water into the corner of the horse stalls, and the track down from the limestone shelf had been half washed out by the runoff and would need to be regraded before a wagon could use it safely. Jeremiah worked. This was not a surprise. Fannie had always known he was a hard worker. She had seen it over 2 years of neighboring, but she had not until now seen him work in the context of her comfort, and there was a quality to it that was different from the simple efficiency of a man doing necessary tasks. He repaired Pete's roof in the afternoon rain that kept falling, lighter now but persistent, working with methodical attention and not complaining. He worked the fence lines. He regraded a section of the track using Pete's heavy spade and a drag he fashioned from 2 fence rails and a length of chain, sweating in the gray heat of the post-storm day, and he did all of this without being asked and without making a production of it. In the evenings they sat in Pete's kitchen and talked. Real talking, the kind that frontier life mostly did not afford, the kind where you say where you came from and what you wanted and what you lost and what you are still looking for. Pete sat with them and contributed stories at intervals, like a man tending a fire by adding wood at just the right moments, and then he would excuse himself early, because Pete Morrow had not survived 71 years by being obtuse. Jeremiah told her about Texas, about the cattle drives, the long months of them, the beauty of the open grass country and the violence of it, the men he had ridden with and the ones he had lost. He told her about his family, 2 brothers and a sister in San Antonio, his mother still living, his father dead from the war, not from a battle, but from the long damage of it, which was its own kind of battlefield. He told her about the moment in Wichita after the drive, when he had stood in a hotel room and counted his money and understood that he had choices, actual choices, and the freedom of it had nearly knocked him over because he had not been prepared for it. He had spent his whole life doing what was in front of him to do, and here was a space where nothing was in front of him yet and he had to decide what to put there. He had put down roots. That was what he had decided. He had put land under his feet and a roof over his head, and he had worked, and the land had been good mostly, and the work had been satisfying mostly, and there had been a missing piece that he had not wanted to name out loud for fear that naming it would make its absence more painful. Fannie listened. She watched his face while he talked, watched it do the small, honest things it did, and she felt the warmth of it moving through her the way warmth moves through cold hands held near a fire slowly, from the outside in, until the cold was gone and you could not remember having been cold at all. She told him about Missouri, about her mother, who had been a schoolteacher before she married and who had taught Fannie to read from real books, not just the Bible, though they had the Bible too. She told him about the farm there, the good farm, and coming out here with her father who had believed in the West with such conviction that she had caught it from him, the way you catch certainty from people who have a gift for it. She told him about the first winter after her father died, which had been the hardest thing she had ever done, not because of the cold and not even because of the grief, but because of the particular loneliness of being responsible for everything with no one to consult, no one to say, "Do you think this is right?" She had made every decision alone, and she had made them well, and she was proud of that, and also it had been very lonely. She told him this and he listened, and at the end of it he said, "You do not have to do that alone anymore if you do not want to." He said it simply, not as a proposal exactly, not as a declaration exactly, but as a statement of available fact that she could accept or decline as she saw fit, which was entirely the right way to say it for her. She said, "I know." On the third day, the rain stopped completely, and the sky went a hard, clean blue that was the particular blue of aftermath, the sky that comes after weather has had its way and gone. The light was sharp and new, and everything it fell on looked washed and precise. Jeremiah and Pete walked the lower fence together in the morning, and Fannie went with them, wanting to see what the flood had left. The lower pasture held a thin skin of mud over the grass, not deep, just a coating, and in it were the small silver flashes of silt crystals catching the new sun. The smell of it was rich and old, the smell of the river bottom, the smell of country that has been underwater and is now breathing again. It was not unpleasant. It was the smell of beginning. They rode out that afternoon to check on the Collier family. Fannie had borrowed Pete's spare horse, a short-backed bay named Sunday, and the three of them went east along the limestone shelf, and then down through the receding floodwater, which was knee-deep on the horses in the low spots and brown and slow-moving and cold against Fannie's boots. The Collier place was on a low knoll that had kept the house itself above water but the barn had flooded and the stock had been moved by the family to the knoll. And when they arrived they found Dora Collier, who was 30 and the mother of 3 children under 8, attempting to clean mud from her barn floor with a broom while her husband, Walt, tried to save what he could of his harness leather from a rack that had been submerged. They spent 2 hours there, helping, and when they left Fannie felt the particular solace of having done something useful in the aftermath of something large. It was what the frontier taught you, if you paid attention, that the useful thing was always available, that there was always something that could be done with the hands you had, and the doing of it was not just repair but a kind of resistance to the idea that everything was always beyond your control. On the ride back in the long gold light of the late afternoon, Jeremiah rode beside her and their horses fell into a natural matching stride, the way horses do with riders who are at ease with each other, and he said, "You are thinking." "I am always thinking," she said. "I know. What is it this time?" She considered how to put it. "I am thinking about going back," she said, "to my place. When the water is down enough. In 2 more days, I expect." "Yes," she paused, "I want to see it." "Do you want to rebuild?" he asked. The question was careful, not pressuring, just asking which direction she was facing. "Yes," she said, with more certainty than she had expected to feel about it. "It is my land. My father filed that claim. I'm not going to let a flood decide that I am finished there." Something moved across his face that she had come to recognize as a particular form of admiration, the quiet, genuine kind that does not need to perform itself. "I did not think you were," he said. "The soddy needs work," she said. "The walls will have taken water. The floor. I will need to rebuild the root cellar higher up the slope, as I said. The low field will recover, but it will need tending." She said all this as though reciting a list, which she was, a list she had been compiling in her head for 3 days. "I will help," he said. "Jeremiah," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. The horses walked on, unhurried, through the long shadows of the late afternoon, and the grass around them was still bent from the flood but was already beginning to lift, the individual stems reasserting themselves from the mud, which was what grass did. "You should know," she said, "that I am not a woman who does things part way. If I accept your help, it is because I believe in what is being built between us, not just the root cellar." He met her eyes without hesitation. "I know that," he said. "I am not a man who offers part way." "Good," she said. "Good," he said. and the horses walked on, and the sky above them was the deep, calm blue of a sky that has said its piece and is now simply sky. That evening, Pete Morrow made a pot of strong coffee and produced a bottle of whiskey that he kept for occasions, and he said, with the directness of a man who had earned the right to it by having lived long enough, "You two are going to get married, I suppose." Fannie looked at the table. Jeremiah looked at Pete. Pete looked entirely comfortable. "Pete," Jeremiah said, "I have been watching you circle each other for the better part of 2 years," Pete said, without remorse. "I am 71 years old and I do not have the patience I used to, so I am just noting that it would be a fine thing and that I would be glad to witness it when the time comes." Fannie raised her eyes from the table. She looked at Jeremiah, who was looking at her with an expression she had not quite seen before, not the quiet study she knew, but something younger and more open, something that was, if she was reading it correctly, a question. An earnest, undefended question. "He is not wrong," Fannie said, which was perhaps the most careful way a woman had ever said yes. Jeremiah Hale blinked. Then that almost smile came, and then it became the actual smile, the one she had only seen 3 or 4 times in 2 years, and that rearranged his whole face into something of extraordinary warmth. "No," he said, "he is not wrong." Pete poured 3 glasses of whiskey. He held his up and said, "To higher ground." They drank to that. 2 days later, the water had receded enough to travel the lower road, and Fannie went back to her place. She drove the wagon herself with Etta Cobb's mules, and Jeremiah rode alongside on Clover, and they came down the track in the morning, and she saw her place as it was mud-filmed, watermarked along the soddy walls at a line 2 feet up, the garden flattened and silvery with silt, the fence posts along the low field leaning at angles where the current had pushed them. It was not destroyed. It was damaged. There was a significant difference, and she felt it in her chest as something between relief and grief, which was its own particular emotion and not quite like anything else. She climbed down from the wagon and walked to the door of the soddy and opened it. The smell was of mud and damp and the particular cold that comes from stone that has been wet. The floor was a skin of dried mud. The shelf above the fireplace was intact, which seemed remarkable. The floorboards where the tin box of tools had been were heaved slightly, the planks warped, but the box was gone because she had taken it. The walls were dark with moisture, but they were standing. The roof was intact. She stood in the center of the room. The morning light came through the small window in a column that was full of dust and the fine particles of dried silt. It landed on the floor and made the dried mud gleam in a way that was, accidentally and without any intention, beautiful. "It held," Jeremiah said from the doorway. "It held," she agreed. They worked all morning, shoveling the mud from the floor, carrying it out in buckets, piling it against the fence line where it would dry and eventually add to the soil. They worked side by side in the close space of the soddy, with a companionship that was so easy and natural that it felt as though they had been doing it for years. The way they moved around each other without collision, the way they knew which task the other was moving toward and left it open, or took it up according to what was needed. It was the kind of collaboration that grows slowly between 2 people who have each learned, separately, to be competent, and who have now discovered that their particular kinds of competence fit together without waste. In the afternoon, while Fannie aired the soddy and began the work of assessing what needed rebuilding, Jeremiah walked the property with her, and they staked the location for the new root cellar, farther up the slope, in the well-drained soil above the limestone ledge, away from the flood line by a good 10 feet of elevation. He paced it out, and she marked it with stakes, and they stood over the staked rectangle and looked at it as though it were already real. "We can get the digging done in a week if the weather holds," he said. "I have the lumber for the door in the barn," she said. "My father put it by. He was planning to build a proper house and he started collecting lumber when he could. There is more than enough for a good root cellar frame." "Your father was a planner," Jeremiah said. "He was," she said. "He planned everything carefully. She looked at the middle distance. He did not always plan the right things." He planned for the farm and the house and the fields. He did not plan for himself, for his own life to last. She said this without bitterness, just with the accuracy of someone who has had time to understand a thing. That is more common than it ought to be, Jeremiah said. Yes, she looked at the stakes in the ground. I planned differently. I planned for myself. He was quiet for a moment, standing beside her in the afternoon light with the smell of mud and recovering grass around them. Then he said, with the deliberateness of a man choosing each word like you choose a tool, for what it will actually do, not for how it looks, I would like to file a proposal with you, Fannie. A formal one. I know Pete got ahead of things and I let him, but I would like to say it myself clearly, so there is no confusion about what I mean. She turned to face him. He did not reach for her. He stood with a kind of formal gravity that was not stiff but was careful, that said this mattered too much for casual handling. I want to marry you, he said. I want to build something here with you on your land, on my land, on whatever land makes sense, and I want to do it with you, not separately and alongside, but together. I am not asking you to need me. I know you do not need me. I am asking you to choose me, the same way I choose you. She had thought she would need time. She was not a woman who rushed toward things. But she found that she had already had the time, had used it over 2 years of neighbors' help and shared meals and the particular space on a wagon bench, and that she was not, in fact, standing at the beginning of this decision but somewhere well past the middle of it. Yes, she said, I choose you. He stepped forward then, finally, and took her hands in his, not a gesture of possession, but of meeting. Two people's hands coming together in the afternoon light above the staked-out promise of a root cellar, with the smell of flood silt in the air and the creek in the distance returned now to something closer to its ordinary self, running lower and cleaner and quieter, as though it, too, had said what it came to say, and was now simply going about its business. He held her hands and looked at her for a long moment, and then, with the careful precision of a man not accustomed to such gestures who is making one anyway, with full intention, he bent his head and kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who has been certain about something for a long time and is finally saying so, slow and deliberate and warm, and she kissed him back with the same honesty she brought to everything, not holding anything in reserve, just yes, exactly this. When they separated, she kept her hands in his and looked up at him, and he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on a human face before in quite that configuration, and she understood, in the way you understand things that are also feelings, that this was what he looked like when he was entirely happy. She thought she probably looked something similar. We should tell Pete, she said. He laughed at that, a real laugh, full and surprised, and it rang out across the recovering field and startled a meadowlark up from the grass into the brilliant afternoon sky. And Fannie watched it go and thought that some sounds were so good you wanted to hear them every day for the rest of your life. They told Pete that evening over his supper table, and Pete said, "Took you long enough," and then produced a second bottle of whiskey from somewhere even more private than the first one, and proposed a toast to both of them that lasted approximately 4 minutes and touched on themes including the nature of good land, the importance of patience, the particular beauty of two people who knew their own worth finding each other, and the creek, which Pete said had done them a favor by rising when it did, though he would not recommend flooding as a general strategy for romance. They married in September of 1878, on a Saturday morning at the small Methodist church that the settlement had built the previous year with lumber hauled from Wichita. The minister was a young man named Reverend Gills, who had come out from Ohio with more conviction than experience, but whose conviction was real, and the ceremony he performed was plain and sincere, and exactly right for two people who valued plainness and sincerity above ceremony. Etta Cobb was there with all 6 of her children, scrubbed and dressed with the kind of effort that said this occasion mattered. Her husband, Frank, who was a quiet man and a good one, stood with Pete Morrow in the front row and looked appropriately solemn. The Collier family came, Walt and Dora and their 3 children, still recovering from their own flood damage, but there, because this was what the community did, it showed up. Alphonse Delacroix came, a large man with a French grandfather's name and a Kansas farmer's hands, and he brought his wife, Marie, who brought a spice cake she had been making for celebrations since she arrived in the territory. Old Luther Graves from the settlement's general store came, and two of the hands from the Delacroix operation who had become fond of Jeremiah in the way working men become fond of someone who works honestly alongside them. Fannie wore a dress she had made herself in the 3 weeks between the proposal and the wedding, from blue calico she had ordered from the store, fitted at the waist and full-skirted, not elaborate but right, and her hair was done up with a care that it did not usually receive, and she stood beside Jeremiah Hale in the small church with the September light coming through the windows in long, warm lines, and she said her vows in a clear, steady voice that did not tremble once. Because she had chosen this with her whole heart and her whole mind and her whole stubborn, capable, surviving self, and there was nothing in it to tremble about. Jeremiah's voice, saying the same words back to her, was what she expected, low and direct and unhurried, each word given its proper weight. He held her hands the way he had in the field above the root cellar stakes, the way of meeting rather than holding, and when the minister pronounced them married and said he could kiss his bride, Jeremiah Hale looked at Fannie Hale, now, with that expression that was entirely happy, and kissed her in front of everybody with a thoroughness that made Etta Cobb's eldest daughter, who was 12, cover her face and giggle, and made Pete Morrow say, quietly but clearly, "Good man." The reception was in the churchyard, which was the frontier equivalent of a proper reception hall, with tables brought from the store and food brought by everyone who attended, and a fiddler named Caleb Marsh who played for 2 hours without repeating himself, which was not quite true, but was the impression he gave. And the dancing was on the hard-packed earth under the September sky, which had gone, by the afternoon, to the clean, specific blue of the best Kansas days, with high white clouds and a wind from the south that was still warm. Fannie danced with Jeremiah, who was not a natural dancer but was a willing one, and she danced with Pete, who had been a natural dancer once and still had the memory of it in his feet if not the full execution. She danced with Walt Collier while Jeremiah danced with Dora, and she danced once with Alphonse Delacroix, who danced with great enthusiasm and questionable technique. And then she stood at the edge of the dancing and watched the whole of it and felt something she could only describe as abundance, which was not a feeling she had had much occasion for in her previous life, and which she found, now that she was having it, to be exactly as good as it sounded. They went home that evening, the two of them, to Jeremiah's house, his place on the high ground, the house he had built 3 years ago on the limestone rise, which was better built than her soddy, because he had had more time and more hands when he built it, with 2 real rooms and a covered porch and a kitchen garden that was her work now as much as his. They had decided to base from his place for the time being, because it was higher and more solid, while they rebuilt hers and decided what to do with both parcels of land for the long run. The 2 properties between them made 320 acres, which was enough for a serious farm operation, which was what they were going to make of it. The house was warm when they arrived, because Pete had come ahead of them and lit the stove and left a covered pot of something on it, and there was a lantern burning on the porch. Pete. He had been, in his quiet and mostly unasked-for way, a present and generous force in both their lives, and Fannie thought, standing on the porch of her new home in the September dusk with her husband's hand warm in hers, that she was going to find a way to take care of that old man as he got older, because someone should, and she was glad to be someone who could. The fall of 1878 was a good one. The flood damage repaired itself with the generosity Pete had predicted. The low field came up the following spring richer than it had been before, the silt having worked through the soil over the winter months into a dark, well-structured composition that made the first seedlings push up with a vigor that was gratifying to see. The root cellar was dug and framed and roofed before the first hard frost, set into the slope well above the flood line, and when Fanny stored the fall harvest in it, potatoes and turnips, and the jars of pickled things and the smoked meat and the crocks of lard. She stood at the entrance in the October cold and looked at it full, and felt a satisfaction that was deep and quiet and entirely hers. Jeremiah proved to be, in the intimate context of a shared life, essentially who he had been at a distance, which was the best thing Fanny could have hoped for, because sometimes people were different up close, and sometimes that different was a disappointing difference. He was steady and practical and attentive. He woke early and worked hard, and he talked to her in the evenings with the same quality of listening and speaking that had drawn her to him in the first place, not diminished by familiarity but deepened by it, the way a river deepens its channel over time. He could be quiet for long stretches and then unexpectedly funny, a dry, specific humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh in a way she had not laughed in years. He was a good man. She had known he was a good man for 2 years. Living with the fact of it daily was a different thing than knowing it at a distance, and the difference was entirely in the better direction. She, in turn, was who she had been. She was not a soft woman, and she did not become one because she was loved, which was not how softness worked anyway. She remained direct and capable, and she held her opinions with conviction while remaining genuinely open to his, and she ran the household with the same methodical competence she brought to everything else, and she did not apologize for knowing her own mind. He did not want her to. He had spent 2 years watching a woman who knew her own mind and had decided, with considerable deliberateness, that it was exactly what he wanted. They had their disagreements. These were not many or terrible, but they were real, because they were real people and not the uncomplicated figures in a story. They disagreed about the best location for a new fence line along the eastern property boundary, and they negotiated this over 3 evenings of after-supper talk, and eventually came to a solution that was neither what she had first proposed nor what he had first proposed, but was better than either, which was usually how their disagreements resolved. They disagreed once, more seriously, about whether to sell the south field of his parcel to a land speculator who came by in the spring of 1879, offering good money for frontier acreage. Fanny was against it with a conviction that she found difficult to fully articulate, but that was rooted in everything her father had taught her about land. That you did not sell it, that you kept it. That land was the only thing that was always going to be worth what you paid for it, and usually more. Jeremiah was tempted by the price, which was fair, but he listened to her fully and then sat with it for a day and then said that she was right, that they should keep it, that the land would be more valuable in 5 years than the money would be, and that was the end of it. She appreciated that he had not just deferred to her. He had actually thought it through. The difference mattered. In the winter of 1879, Fanny found herself with child. She knew it before she was certain of it, in the particular way of women who pay close attention to their own bodies, which she did, and she told Jeremiah on a cold January evening by the stove in the kitchen without preamble, because preamble was not really in her nature. She said, "I believe I am expecting." He looked up from the harness he was mending, and went very still in the way he went still, when something important was happening that he was trying to experience fully. Then he set the harness down on the table and stood up and came to her and took her face in his 2 hands, those large, careful hands, and looked at her. And what was in his eyes was not performance but something genuine and enormous, gratitude and wonder, and a kind of tenderness so concentrated it was almost painful to receive. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. He kissed her forehead. He held her hands for a long moment. Then he said, "I am going to have a great deal of trouble not telling Pete immediately." "You may tell Pete," she said, "tomorrow." He told Pete the following morning, riding up to the limestone shelf in a January wind with his breath making clouds in the cold air. And Pete, who was splitting wood in his yard, set down his axe and crossed his arms and looked at Jeremiah with an expression of tremendous satisfaction and said, "Fine news. Fine, fine news." He came to supper that evening and brought a small carved wooden horse. He had made at some point for reasons that were unclear, but that was beautiful, clearly made by hands that had been gifted at carving once and still had some of the gift left in them. And he gave it to Fannie, and said it was for the child when the child was old enough to have it. And she thanked him with a warmth that made the old man look briefly like the younger man he had been. The baby came in August of 1880, in the height of summer, in the two-room house on the limestone rise with the covered porch and the kitchen garden outside the window. Etta Cobb served as midwife, which she had done for half the county's women, having a combination of practical knowledge and unflappable calm that made her the obvious choice. The labor was long but not dangerous, and Jeremiah, who was sent to wait on the porch and who was the most composed person to occupy a front porch in the history of front porches, except on this particular day, was not composed at all and paced the length of it approximately 40 times and drank 4 cups of coffee and was on his 5th when Etta opened the door and told him to come in. The baby was a boy. He was red-faced and loud and excellent, and when Jeremiah Hale took his son in his arms for the first time he stood by the window in the August light and looked at him with an expression that Fannie, watching from the bed, had never seen on a human face before and was certain she would never forget. It was not the happy expression, though that was in it. It was something more fundamental recognition, she thought. The look of a man meeting someone he already loves completely and has not yet been introduced to. They named him Samuel Jeremiah Hale, for her father first and his father second, and he was from the beginning a loud, decisive, physically determined person who crawled at 6 months and walked at 10, and fell down constantly without apparent distress, and got up and tried again, which was, Fannie thought, appropriately representative of his heritage. Young Samuel was 14 months old when Pete Morrow had a fall in his yard, missed the step off his porch in the October dusk, and came down hard on his hip. Jeremiah was there to help him up and get him inside, and it was not a break, the hip, but it was a bad bruise and a bad scare, and after it they had the conversation that needed having, which was that Pete Morrow was 73 years old and the limestone shelf farm was more than one man should manage alone. They moved him in with them that winter. They added a room to the back of the house, built in November by Jeremiah and Walt Collier, and 2 of the Delacroix hands, a good room with its own small stove and a window that looked east toward the sunrise, and Pete moved into it with his things which were few, because he had never accumulated many things, only the things he used, and settled into it with the dignity of a man accepting help without relinquishing himself. He and young Samuel became fast companions in the way that very old people and very young people sometimes do, a friendship of complete mutual fascination, and Pete taught the boy to identify birds by their call before he could reliably identify colors, which was exactly the kind of education Fannie approved of. The farm grew. By 1882, they were running cattle on the east pasture, 40 head of good shorthorns that Jeremiah bought from a drover passing through, and they had the wheat coming in reliably on the high field, and the kitchen garden expanded to a proper kitchen plot that supplied them through the winter and had enough surplus for the settlement market on Saturdays, where Fannie sold preserves and dried herbs and in good years green beans and corn, and once a remarkable quantity of cucumbers that Etta Cobb told her she was pricing too low, which was probably true. The settlement itself was growing. There was a school now, a proper one with a hired teacher, a woman named Miss Clara Arnott who had come out from Indiana and who was, in Fannie's estimation, one of the best things that had happened to the county since the homesteading opened up. There was a doctor, a young man named Dr. Webb who had set up a practice in 1880 and was still finding his footing in frontier medicine, but was earnest and competent and willing to learn what the country needed him to know. The general store had expanded twice. There was talk of a post office. Fannie taught at the school herself on 2 afternoons a week from 1882 onward, because Miss Arnott had 40 students across 6 grades and could use the help, and because Fannie had been a reader since her mother taught her to read, and she believed, with the same conviction she brought to everything, that reading was the most important thing a person could learn, and she wanted to be part of teaching it. The children who came through her reading sessions were of varying willingness, but she was patient with the unwilling ones and firm with the ones who were capable and lazy, which was not so different from farming, when you thought about it, understanding what each piece of ground needed in order to produce. She was 29 in 1883, and Samuel was 3, and running constantly and talking in long, complicated, frequently philosophical sentences that made Pete Morrow cry laughing at least once a week. And she was expecting again, which she had told Jeremiah in the same manner as the first time, directly, without preamble, by the stove, and he had responded in the same manner as the first time, with that full, concentrated stillness, and then the taking of her hands. "Are you well?" he asked as he had before. "I am very well," she said as she had before. He kissed her as he had before and held her hands, and then added this time, "I am still going to have trouble not telling Pete immediately. Pete will know before I have finished the sentence," she said. "He watches me like a hawk." This was true. Pete Morrow had at 74 the observational powers of a man half his age and considerably more experience using them, and he was watching from the doorway of his room with an expression of considerable smugness when she turned around, which was annoying and also deeply endearing. "Fine news," he said. "Again, fine news." The second baby arrived in February of 1884, in the deep of winter, and he was also a boy, another loud, red-faced, decisive person, whom they named Thomas Peter Hale, for Jeremiah's younger brother and for Pete Morrow, who received the honor with a dignity that lasted approximately 10 seconds before he had to excuse himself to the porch, where Jeremiah found him shortly after sitting on the porch step in the February cold with his face in his hands, not crying exactly, but in the vicinity of it. "You all right, old man?" Jeremiah said, and sat beside him. "I am perfectly fine," Pete said, in a voice that was doing its best. "I am just, it is a fine name is all." "She wanted it," Jeremiah said. "I was not going to argue." "No," Pete said, "you have always been a man with sense." He wiped his face with his coat sleeve and straightened up and looked out at the February fields. "I did not think," he said after a moment, "when I got old that it would feel like this. I thought it would feel more like being alone. I have been alone most of my life, and I expected more of the same." "Is that all right?" Jeremiah asked. "That it is not like that?" Pete looked at him sideways with those still sharp eyes. "Son," he said, "it is the best thing I did not plan for." In the house, young Samuel was telling his new baby brother with great authority about birds. The spring of 1884 brought good news for the county in the form of a better road connection to Wichita, which meant better prices for crops and better access to supplies. And it brought a hard political argument to the settlement about the land rights of the remaining Osage and Kansa peoples, whose territory this had been before the treaties, and the removals that the government had enforced through the 1870s. The argument was not comfortable, and it did not resolve cleanly, because these things did not resolve cleanly. The injustice was too large and too old and too thoroughly woven into the fabric of what everyone around Fannie had built their lives on, including her, including the parcel her father had claimed. She did not look away from this. She talked about it with Jeremiah, late in the evenings, and he talked about it with the direct and uncomfortable honesty he brought to hard things, acknowledging what had been taken and from whom, acknowledging that the system that had given them their land had been built on removal, and that knowing this did not dissolve the claim, but it did create an obligation to treat the land well, to build something on it that justified the cost others had paid, to not waste what had been given at such price. Fannie agreed with all of it, and she thought about it often, more than she thought about most things, and she taught her sons about it when they were old enough to understand, not to make them feel guilty, but to make them feel responsible, which was the thing that actually produced change in people and the world. The years moved the way good years do on good land, full and fast and seasonal, each one different and each one building on the last. By the fall of 1885, they had added a second proper room to the house, making it 4 rooms in total, and Fannie had a kitchen that was fully and properly hers, with a proper iron range and a real table and the kind of light she wanted, because her father had been right about that and she had never forgotten it. A woman needed light. Pete Morrow's health held better than anyone expected. He was 76 in 1885, and he moved more slowly, and his hip bothered him in cold weather. But he was present and sharp, and he tended a small kitchen garden of his own beside the house that was not needed, strictly speaking, because Fannie's garden was more than sufficient, but that was his, and that mattered. He sat with the boys in the evening and told stories that were sometimes true and sometimes embellished and occasionally invented wholesale, but were always gripping, and both boys, Samuel, 5, a serious and bird-obsessed child, and Thomas, 1, a round and delighted person who was beginning to walk with great commitment and no grace, were transfixed by him. In the evenings, after the boys were asleep and Pete had retired to his room, and the house was quiet with the particular quiet of a full house that has rested, Fannie and Jeremiah sat together. Sometimes they talked, and sometimes they read. She had accumulated a small but real collection of books, and he had taken to reading with a steady pleasure he had not had time for before this. And sometimes they simply sat, which was possible between two people who were comfortable in each other's silence the way they were comfortable in each other's presence, which was completely. She looked at him sometimes in these quiet evenings, with the lamp making his face warm and the book open in his lap, and the silver-gray cat they had acquired from the Collier farm sitting on the hearth, and she thought about the morning she had loaded the wagon and left the space. She thought about the sky that day and the smell of the coming rain and the sound of Clover's hooves on the track, and she thought about what it would have been like if she had not left that space, or if he had not come, or if he had come and she had not already been moving, and the particular way the whole of everything that followed had balanced on that morning, on that bench, on that one deliberate gap in the load she had left for him. She thought all this, and then she looked at Jeremiah Hale, who chose this moment, as he often did, with an uncanny sense of when she was looking to look up from his book and look at her. He did not say anything. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with that full, honest attention, and then the corner of his mouth did its particular elevation, and she looked back at him with the full and honest warmth that she had stopped making small back in 1878 on a wet road north of Bitter Creek. She reached across and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over beneath hers and held it. Outside, the Kansas night was enormous and full of stars, the way it got in the clear fall air, and the limestone rise that their house sat on was solid beneath them, above the flood line of any ordinary year and most extraordinary ones, and the root cellar on the slope was full, and the children were asleep, and the old man in the back room was breathing quietly, and the land stretched out in every direction toward a future that was not guaranteed but was being built, steadily and well, by two people who had chosen each other on a rising creek and never once regretted it. By 1887, the farm was producing at a rate that Fannie's father had dreamed of but never lived to see. The wheat came in at a yield that meant they could sell a good portion and still lay by more than enough for the year. The cattle herd had grown to 65 head, and Jeremiah had hired a young hand named Eli, who was 19 and from Tennessee, and earnest in the way of young men who have recently discovered they are good at something they did not know they were good at, which in Eli's case was everything related to cattle and horses. He lived in the small bunkroom they had added to the barn in the spring, and he was so reliably present and useful and cheerful that the whole household had absorbed him into its fabric without particular ceremony, the way the frontier absorbed capable people. Samuel was 7 and in school, a serious student of everything except arithmetic, which he found less interesting than the natural world. And Miss Arnott, still there, still excellent, with 2 years of teaching in the territory now adding to her Indiana education, a knowledge of what actually mattered on the frontier, had learned to give Samuel the arithmetic problems in the context of distances between bird populations or the quantity of seed needed for a given acreage, which helped considerably. Thomas was 3 and had developed the personality, in full and committed form, of a person who believes that rules are interesting starting points for negotiation, which was exhilarating and tiring in equal measure. He had Pete Morrow's eyes, the same sharp, watchful quality, and Fannie's stubbornness, and Jeremiah's silence when he was thinking, which was the most alarming combination because you never knew if he was being quiet because nothing was happening or because something was very much happening and he had not announced it yet. Pete Morrow died in the winter of 1888. He was 79 years old and he died in his bed in his room with the east-facing window, on a cold January morning with the snow coming down in the quiet, heavy way of real winter snow, and it was Fannie who found him, because she was the one who brought his morning coffee. He looked, lying in his bed with his eyes closed and his face finally smooth of the work it always held during the day, like a man who had finished something he was satisfied to have finished. She stood for a moment and held his coffee cup and looked at him, and then she set the cup on the windowsill and went and got Jeremiah. They buried him on the limestone shelf on his own property, where he had asked to be buried, next to the small cairn he had built years ago for a dog he had lost, which was the only other thing buried on that land that he had loved enough to mark. The whole settlement came, or near enough. Fannie did not cry at the grave. She had cried already privately, and she was not a woman who performed grief for an audience. She stood by the grave in the January cold with Jeremiah's arm around her and Samuel beside her holding Thomas's hand, with the protective seriousness of a 7-year-old who has been told something important and is treating it with all the gravity he can manage. And she said goodbye to the man who had put a warm lamp on her porch and cleared his south stalls and poured whiskey in the kitchen, and watched her and Jeremiah circle each other for 2 years and finally, impatiently, said the thing that needed saying. She spoke at the grave not long, because she was not a woman of long speeches but honest, because she was a woman of honest ones. She said that Pete Morrow had lived fully and left something behind in everyone he had known, and that the shape of what he had left was in the 2 boys standing here today, one of whom bore his name, and in the house on the high ground, and in the fact that she and Jeremiah had found each other, which might have taken considerably longer without his interference. There was quiet laughter at that, the warm kind, the kind that honors rather than diminishes. They deeded Pete's land to the county for a school when the settlement grew large enough to need a second one, because that is what he had asked for, because he believed in schools the way he believed in birds and good weather and the land coming back after a flood. He believed in things that persisted and reproduced themselves and got better over time, and schools did that. The world around them was changing in the late 1880s. The frontier was filling up, the open spaces between homesteads narrowing as more people came, and the cattle drives that had once been the defining feature of the Kansas economy were being replaced by rail lines and feedlots, and a different kind of ranching than the open-range driving that Jeremiah had come up through. He watched these changes with the equanimity of a man who had learned to adapt, who had, in fact, chosen adaptation as a life strategy in Wichita in 1875 when he counted his $32 and decided what to put in the empty space in front of him. The farm changed with the times. They planted more diversely. They improved the cattle herd by selecting for quality rather than quantity. They joined the Farmers Cooperative in 1889 when it formed in the settlement, because Fannie argued, correctly, that collective negotiating power was the only way small farmers were going to survive the price pressures that the railroad companies were beginning to apply to grain transport. She attended the cooperative meetings herself, which was not unremarkable. There were not many women who spoke at those meetings, and a few men who found it unremarkable in the wrong direction. But she spoke with such precise and well-grounded knowledge of costs and markets, and the actual economics of what she was doing every day, that the arguing tended to stop fairly quickly, and the meeting moved on to her point. Jeremiah went with her when he could, and sat in the back and listened. And occasionally in the evenings, he told her that she was the most formidable person he had ever known, which was not something he said easily or often, which was exactly why it meant what it meant. In 1890, Samuel was 10, and Thomas was 6, and both of them were in school, and both of them were running the long perimeter of the farm on summer mornings with Eli, who had become their hero in the specific way of slightly older working men who are not quite adults, and not quite family but somewhere between, who teach you things that adults who love you too much to let you fail will not teach you. Which is things like how to fall off a horse correctly, and how to tell direction from the stars, and how to whistle through a blade of grass. Eli had been with them 3 years and showed no signs of wanting to be anywhere else, which suited everyone. Fannie was 36 in 1890, and she was, by any measurement available to the time and place, thriving. The farm was thriving. The family was thriving. She was still teaching 2 afternoons a week at the school, which now had a second teacher, a young man named Mr. Hooper, who had come from Ohio, and who was earnest and good with the older students, leaving Fannie's reading sessions for the younger ones, who were her favorites anyway because they were at the beginning of everything and she loved beginnings. Loved the moment when a child understood that the marks on the paper were making a sound, and that sound was a word, and that word was meaning, and that meaning was the whole world opening up. She had never stopped loving that moment. Not in 8 years of sitting with children and books. She was pregnant again in the summer of 1890, which she discovered with the same deliberate inward attention as the first 2 times, and reported to Jeremiah in the same manner. And he responded in the same manner as the first 2 times and the second 2 times, which was with the full, concentrated stillness, and then the question, "Are you well?" and the answer, "I am very well," and the kiss and the held hands. He did not tell Pete, because Pete was gone, and the absence of Pete in that moment was its own quiet ache. He told Eli instead the next morning, and Eli said, "Well, that is wonderful news," with a grin wide enough to split his face, and that was good too, because joy has to go somewhere. The third child was a girl. She arrived in January of 1891, small and dark-haired and furious about the cold, and they named her Margaret Catherine Hale, and she was from the first moment the most determined person in a house full of determined people, which was saying something. Samuel, who was 10, held her with the careful gravity of a boy who understands he has been handed something important. Thomas, who was 6, looked at her for a long moment and then said, with the philosophical tone he had been perfecting since age 3, "She is very loud for how small she is," which was accurate. Jeremiah sat with the baby in the chair by the fire that evening, after the house had quieted, after Etta Cobb had gone home and Eli had tactfully occupied the barn, and Fannie watched him from the bed with the warm, bone-deep satisfaction of someone who is in the right place and knows it. He was 39 years old, and his dark hair had silver in it at the temples now, which suited him, and his face was more weathered than it had been when she met him, which also suited him, and he was looking at his daughter with the recognition he had looked at his sons with, the meeting of someone already loved. "Margaret," he said softly, trying the name. "Maggie," Fannie said from the bed. "When she is older." He looked up and smiled at her, the full smile, the one that rearranged his face, the one she had been watching for 13 years now and had never once gotten tired of. "Maggie," he agreed. She settled back against the pillow and listened to the fire and the January wind and the quiet breathing of the house. Samuel and Thomas were asleep in their room. Maggie was in her father's arms. Outside, the Kansas night was doing what it always did, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and the high ground beneath them was solid and enduring, and the root cellar on the slope was full for the third winter in a row, and the land stretched out toward the future the way land did, patiently, enormously, without promises, only with the possibility that what you put into it would in time come back. She thought about Bitter Creek. She thought about it sometimes, the way you think about a thing that changed everything, not with regret, never with regret, but with a kind of reverential understanding of how thin the line is between what happened and what might have. She thought about the sky that morning, that bruised, wrong sky, and the water line on the cottonwood roots, and the 3 days of loading and the space. She thought about herself at 24, young, alone, capable, grieving her father, loving her land, holding her most important feelings close because the frontier took what you declared too loudly, and leaving a gap on the bench beside her because some part of her had always known that the right person would understand what the gap meant. He had understood. She looked at Jeremiah Hale in the firelight, her husband of 12 years, the father of her children, the man who had ridden at a gallop to warn her about a creek that she had already read in the sky, and who had taken the seat she had left for him without asking more questions than were needed and without making the moment smaller than it was. She thought, we are built well, the two of us, like a fence Pete Morrow would have approved of, like a root cellar on higher ground, like a house on a limestone shelf above the flood line, with light in the windows and enough rooms, and a porch to sit on in the evenings when the sky goes the clean, hard blue of aftermath. Built to last. Built to live in. Built on ground that had been tested and had held. Jeremiah looked up from the baby as he always did when she was looking, and he looked at her with those gray eyes and that expression, the completely happy one, and said nothing because nothing was needed. She smiled at him. He smiled back. The fire settled in the grate. The baby breathed. The house held. Outside, somewhere far off in the January dark, Bitter Creek ran in its bed between its banks, low and cold and quiet now, doing what creeks do after they have had their say, returning to themselves, carrying whatever they carry, moving on toward something else, indifferent to the lives they have shaped by their rising and falling, indifferent to the love they have made possible by their timing, carrying everything and nothing, the way moving water always does, toward whatever comes next.